AI is making headlines in the news every day, from the latest breakthrough in deep learning to the ethical implications of AI-powered decision-making. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Joe Peake, a commercial director for Windward.ai, who's leading their strategy and expansion in the supply chain sector. Joe, I'm looking forward to this conversation as we'll be attempting to demystify the role and application of AI in supply chain. As a company that's been very much at the forefront of understanding and applying artificial intelligence to solve challenges, most notably in maritime domain awareness and compliance, you've recently expanded your solution offering to support supply chain professionals, which is no doubt an oversimplification and one I'm sure you'll expand on. And while I know you've done a particularly good job over the years of marketing yourselves as a company synonymous with these technologies, everyone from the milkman to your great aunt now knows about AI thanks to ChatGPT. But before we start to ascend Everest, let's first get to base camp. So my first question for you, Joe, is can you please start by explaining what AI is, what it does, and how it works?
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Rory. So just to take some simple steps first, I guess. So AI is just the simulation of human intelligence. And that's done within machines that are programmed to just think and learn like we do. Okay. Those machines, they use algorithms, statistical models, and data to perform massive tasks that human beings just take a lot longer to achieve. That in the simplest form is like what AI is. Problem solving, decision making, speech recognition, language translation, all of these things are like good examples. But ChatGPT, in your intro there, is a pretty good use case, right? Because it's now so strong in the public domain. I think the thing to just think about is that is a tiny application of what AI is. And also equally, the AI models are only as good as the data they're trained on, right? Garbage in, garbage out. It still applies even for an AI model, right? It's not that smart. If you look at ChatGPT, it's only trained on data after 2021. So, however, what I think's happened is, and ChatGPT, I think, has been the driver amongst others as well, is that if you think about product adoption cycles, we've landed in a mass market environment in the consumer domain with ChatGPT. It's a B2C application, not a B2B one. And if we then think about supply chains, there is such a wide application of AI, but there's not deep adoption, right? And so we see that in our interactions all the time, that businesses now want to be educated about what AI is because it's so prominent in the press, but equally they're approaching it in quite a skeptical way, right?
Why do you think that is then, that consumers would be the first to adopt AI in kind of everyday life, like people have with ChatGPT, from writing emails to putting together their homework, whatever it may be? Yet arguably these technologies can be more effective in domains like supply chain, yet adoption seems slower.
So I think it's easier, right, to do something like ChatGPT in like an advanced research setting. Is a great deal easier because it's using public domain information. If you look at what we do in an AI world, it's very much on private data and public data, which makes it a great deal more complicated. I also think in supply chains, businesses are proud of what they've achieved, right? And I think supply chains need a bit of credit in that they do actually work, right? Things may get stuck in the Suez Canal, and COVID's created a lot of problems, but things still do move around the world. And so I think that with all of those major events that have disappeared and that disruptions died down, people are less excited to look at something like AI to automate something that they believe has now settled down.
Yeah, to your point about supply chains actually working, kind of no news is good news. And For the average consumer, you didn't know what the supply chain was until 2021 when things started to break. They didn't turn up at your door on time, or they might got more expensive.
Yeah, no, exactly. And the other thing I think that we are very aware of and like show a lot of empathy with is that AI is all about efficiency, automation, etc. And people are concerned about how that sits with human interaction, right? And I think that consumers that are able to get a faster answer or a deeper piece of research or automate something, that solves a very quick problem in their daily lives. In a business setting, that is just a great deal more complicated. And so it's actually summed up quite nicely in a conversation I had earlier this week I just took a step back to say, Mr. Customer, why are you interested in AI? And the answer was, well, AI won't take our jobs, but the humans that interact and use it best, they will, right? And I think that type of premise and way of thinking is what we need to adopt when talking about AI. Like, how can it support human decision making and enable that human decision making?
I think that's such a good point around the kind of wider adoption of ChatGPT, because people are able to experience it far easier, get those little wins, and then reinforce the idea of it being a kind of net positive rather than the kind of doomsday scenarios that people can sometimes think about. Oh, is it going to replace my job, or will I be needed in a year's time if I almost let this cuckoo into the nest?
Precisely. Yeah, absolutely.
So all that being said, then, how can this be applied successfully in supply chains, and what challenges specifically do you think it solves?
Yeah, for sure. It's a really good question. Something that we're like working on and challenged with every day, right? And I think firstly, supply chains are complicated, right? They are just multi-dimensional problems, high numbers of actors within it, which makes it a very good fit for AI, but it is a very, very complicated like domain to be working in. And if you think about all of the handoffs within a supply chain, I think AI has an application across all of them, right? And we see that in lots of like early innovative businesses around demand planning, purchase order management, supplier performance, real-time visibility, prediction of arrivals, all this type of thing. But, you know, as I said earlier, they do work, right? Supply chains are still moving. But I think what we're finding is that there are a number of like siloed parties within supply chains, okay, that haven't over the years interacted together as best they could. They are siloed, and they also sit on enormous data sets, okay? These data sets could have been acquired third party, they could have been EDI connections, they could be proprietary information. It doesn't matter to us or to AI what it is. But I think if you're able to firstly complement those data sets, enrich them in a certain way, and then tease out the important parts, right? AI then, in a very systemic way, will cleanse all of that, help you spot trends, and then you can start to optimize supply chain. And I'll go back to what I said in the beginning. This can be across demand planning, predicting ETAs, purchase order management, whatever it is, right? And it's those trends that are the enablers for humans to make better decisions.
Just going back to a point you said at the start of that, people often talk about the supply chain being fragmented, and I think you described it as like these big actors, but they're siloed. What example of kind of two siloed actors that could be communicating perhaps better than they do?
Well, let's just take an ocean freight example. If we take from leg A, which is typically like upstream when a purchase order is actually placed, and how a supplier communicates cargo ready dates to someone actually collecting a shipment, a haulier or an ocean carrier to collect that shipment, that handoff is always been a friction point and typically not communicated well. The ocean carriers then, when they get into a port of destination, and how they communicate with a terminal operator is bizarrely pretty bad, and there are instances where it's awful, right? And I think that if you just look at those few examples, they are pivotal in the smooth movement of a boxed or a containerized move, right? And already they aren't interacting as well as they could.
Yeah, that's fascinating, especially considering the importance of those two parties in particular to coordinate effectively.
Sure, but it could also be across documentation handling, right? Or the movement of money and financial payments. So I think and all of these actors, either be it they're part of the operational movement, right? The actual physical movement of the goods, they're to blame, or they could be doing a better job, but also the documentation, the data flows, and how those handoffs work. So I think it's across those three levers.
I think you speak about kind of some of the sexier things that can be achieved by AI in supply chain, right? But in my experience of using and studying AI, like the low-hanging fruit is the non-sexy stuff, like the transactional kind of like laborious number crunching to a certain extent, like less thinking about like what fantastic insights can this AI glean from this big corpus of data that was previously untouched, but how can we just automate or delegate stuff that we do not want to do, that is boring, that isn't hyper productive to these technologies, to then get on and either do other things or think about doing other things. As I'm sure that most businesses do, right? We certainly have a rule to look at every single task that we do on a weekly basis, probably not weekly, in fact, maybe monthly, and say, what can we automate? What can we delegate? The automate part of that in the last 3 months, in terms of the computational power that people now have to do so, has just gone up an order of magnitude.
Yeah, and I think I mean, it's a good point you make, but in sort of our side of the fence, so to speak, we just see that companies are at a different stage of digitalization, or call it adoption of AI, right? And I think AI as an application, or Windward as an organization that sells and utilizes it, has to be aware of where those organizations are in that digitalization journey, that, by the way, never stops. And just be cognizant of like what you're solving for at that moment in time, because, and hopefully we get onto it a little bit later around like, where's it going? I think people can get a bit swept up in the romance of like, everything's going to be automated and all problems are going to be solved for. They're not. We actually have to interact with a defined problem statement, right? And make sure that that becomes actionable and answered, right? As opposed to getting lost in like the fairy tale of how far AI can go. So we always take like a moment to just pause, right? Like, okay, there's an awful lot that we can do and achieve, but let's just make sure that that mundane task, that piece of automation, or that piece of work that's just taking too long, let's just start there.
Yeah, exactly. Like incrementally solving problem by problem, as opposed to immediately jumping to this dystopian future.
Right. Exactly.
Well, using dystopian future as a segue then to the next question, where do you see all of this going then? Give me a kind of 1 to 3 year timeline and perhaps beyond.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you only asked like 1 to 3 years, because
I've got no idea. Like the rest of us, that's why.
Yeah. I think if we just start with like the status quo, right? I think AI already has major proof points around ROI, okay, and cost saving, cost avoidance, improvement of NPS scores, things like that. So I think that is driving a better adoption. And if you see in a very competitive landscape, particularly in a downturn economy, right, if people are applying these types of solutions and you know the competition aren't, you'll quickly get left behind, right? So I think that as day one is happening already. And coupled with that, I think the industry will become better educated, right? Like what it is, how to apply it. And we'll move into like a steady state of like trust, which I don't think in all walks of life is quite there. I also think that going back to the siloed parties within the industry. I think that the different actors within the supply chain will begin to hold each other accountable in a better way, right? And that will be through management by exception, risk management, making data-led decisions, right? I think that will definitely help. And I think then, like, moving a bit more forwards, we're probably going to see businesses starting to work on like how to derive or truly generate like unique competitive advantage using AI. So we have AI models that are trained that are proprietary to us, but how can we accompany what we have directly with business information on the side of the customer to co-create something that is truly unique, right? And solve for very specific industry problems that just that company is coming up against. And I think when that starts to happen, the competitive advantage really accelerates.
Yeah. I think to a point you made earlier as well, that like ChatGPT recently in the news, right? I think there was the whole Samsung thing a couple of weeks ago, realizing that any proprietary code you feed back into those systems gets absorbed, for lack of a better term, into OpenAI and can be spat back out to other users. And the businesses will start to look at kind of these big corpuses of data and anything they've got to say, well, what can we learn from this, and develop their own unique systems that might be able to solve problems that they didn't know they had, or create solutions they didn't realize were possible.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this final off the cuff question, kind of phrased via working theory that I have. So I don't know if this applies to supply chain, but a terrible metaphor or analogy, I should say, would be that all of these kind of like mom and pop shop businesses have just been armed with RPGs in the form of like AI and ChatGPT and whatnot, right? This thing's relatively cheap. Like I mentioned it before, but the computational power is insane. And if used correctly, like the leverage or force multiplier, if you would, is ridiculous. Scalability is now seriously achievable quite quickly for a lot of people who understand and know how to utilize these things. So if you look at trading, for example, like you've got these massive trading firms, Cargill, Vitol, are those traders internally thinking, well, hold on a minute, I don't necessarily have to rely on the internal resources that I've benefited from years to test hypotheses, to execute trades. I can go and do this on my own. So you might see an emergence of loads of kind of like sub 10 people companies because they've got a 10x engineer in the form of OpenAI or Windward.ai or whatever it may be. Do you see something similar happening in supply chain in terms of like the formation of new companies, and I guess what's the word I'm blanking on here, the construction almost of the industry, where you don't necessarily have the big three, Kuehne+Nagel, DHL, DB Schenker, not sure if that's the big three, by the way, sorry if I've missed anyone out, but in 10 years time you have thousands of disparate organizations, each adding value to the supply chain.
So I think it's a good point, and the trading example is definitely going to get there. If you look at what we do within supply chain, and we just look at it from like a milestone standpoint, if we work with a freight forwarder, right, and you've mentioned some big ones there that want to automate their milestones of how they move a shipment within their ERP, their TMS, call it CargoWise. Windward is doing that today for hundreds of thousands of containers with zero manual input. Okay, so you think about the reduction of overheads, people involved, and then how you can break that out to form disparate organizations. Absolutely. I think what we should be cognizant of, though, and I'll just take freight forwarding because we're talking about it, is that forwarders actually provide a great deal of additional value within the transaction. I mean, they're a true agent in the sense that they're squeezed from both sides of the transaction, but they are creating a great deal of value that right now I don't see how AI is going to become a part of. Maybe in 10 years' time, perhaps, but from a milestone standpoint, from an operational efficiency, from surfacing exceptions and managing by exception, absolutely. but I still think that they're going to have a big role to play, like in the value chain.
What's an example of that unique value?
I think you can. Well, I think firstly, I think they understand the industry sectors that they're moving on part of. So retail, automotive, energy, for example. They have a great deal of customs compliance knowledge, like in-house internally, and they're also actually able to just provide customer service. I mean, people still in this day and age want to be phoned or want something pushed to them in a format that they've already received it. And a lot of customers that we meet, they want to standardize certain things to enable the individual on the desk, the operator, whoever it is, to just drive a higher value conversation. I don't think that everyone knows what they're going to drive yet, but it could be the increased use of market intelligence in that conversation. It could be, how do we build our business relationships and partnerships better to get out of that operational, rat race and start to create value in a higher, more strategic sense.
Right. Well, Joe, thanks a lot for spending the time. Fascinating conversation. If you're listening to this and you have been living under a rock and you don't know who Windward.ai are at this stage, go and check them out. Get in touch with Joe to understand how it is that these guys can support you to modernize your efforts in the supply chain.
Thanks, Rory. Thanks a lot.